Putting on the welding jacket, welding the rear end. Things are getting real. Welcome back to the shop. It's been more than a couple of weeks, and it's been a rough couple of weeks, but anyway, I wanted to get back out in the shop and try and get something done. So still kind of pissed off at the Mustang. I got a long list of things that it still needs. The GTO, which is out of frame, is actually in the shop right now. I got a short list of things that I need to do on the GTO as well. But I thought I'd do something different and actually work on the Epic. So it's been over a year that I've been narrowing the rear end on the thing. So I need to do kind of one last really stringent measurement of the rear end housing before I start welding everything up and ordering axles. You know the old saying, measure twice, cut once. Well, yeah, I've learned that the hard way. I've measured once and I've cut a whole bunch of times, and no matter how many times you cut, you can't cut something longer. So want to make sure that I've got everything exactly where I want it for tire clearance before I order axles, because they're pretty expensive. And in Canada, you know, take the US equivalent and you can almost double it by the time it lands here for price. So I want to get that right. And the 10-inch tires on this car are huge. They're like the smallest slicks I've ever owned. But on this tiny little car, they're pretty big. So everything fits really, really tight, which is why I need to make sure that I've got the housing, you know, dimensions exactly right. Because if something is out, you know, even a quarter of an inch somewhere, then a tire's not going to fit. Clearance is that tight. And the street tires I'm looking at running are a 275/50, which are, you know, almost the exact same dimensions as the 26 by 10-inch slicks. So whether it's the street tires or the slicks, again, the rear end's got to be exactly right. So I'm going to change, get into my shop clothes, drag my sorry ass underneath the back of that car, get the slicks kind of fitted up on my fake stub axles, make sure all the dimensions are where they need to be, and then yeah, once I'm happy, we're going to drag the rear end housing out, drop it on the welding bench here, and weld her all up and order some axles and hope that it all works out. So let's get after that. So without having actual axles, what I've done is I've kind of made my own little fake axle setup. So I'm using one of the bushings or pucks, if you want to call them that, from the rear end housing narrowing jig. I've got some 1-inch square tubing and some, I think this is 3/4 round tube, and I've created this nightmare of bolts and hose clamps just to get that square tube centered in the middle of the axle housing here. And for a 9-inch Ford with the big housing ends, the standard distance from this face to the face of the axle is 2.36 inches. So we want to make sure that that's what we've got this thing set up for. So that's a little bit more, but what I'm doing is I'm measuring from this face actually to the face where the wheel bolts to, and we have to include the thickness of the disc brake rotor, which I've measured out to be 0.125 inches. Actually, you know what, let me just go get one of those and I can show you. Okay, we've got our rotor and our caliper, and actually I lied, it's not 125, it's 0.181. So we want to take the 236 distance from the housing flange to the axle flange, and then add the 0.181 to it, and then that's the total distance that we want these things to stick out, because I'm going to be putting the wheels right onto my fake axles. There's no need for me to have the rotor in there for mock-up purposes, but I certainly do need to account for the thickness of it. we got the wheels on. We got the rear end jacked up to our proper ride height, which with the car on the rotisserie works out to about 19 inches above the ground. So we've got the jack stand set on 19 inches underneath both slicks on both sides. Rear end is reasonably centered in the wheel opening. Everything's still tight here. I got to roll that fender opening, and then I'm going to trim out about an inch to an inch and a half on the front here easily, and then I can adjust the control arms to pull everything forward a half an inch or so to get it centered. But what we want to do is check everything in this direction to make sure that we've got the housing centered, we've got the housing cut to the right width, and we're going to be okay for clearance on the outsides of the tires, and then on the insides of the tires to the frame as well. So everything looks good from the outside here. I'm just going to double check to make sure that we are centered. So we've got 2 inches on this side. I already measured the outside. The other side's 2 inches, so we know that we've got the rear end centered. So we're going to crawl underneath the car, check our axle offset. So again, 9-inch forward, 2.36 to the axle flange from the rear end housing flange, and then we need to add the thickness of our brake rotors on there, which was 0.18. So it works out to 2.55 inches, a little bit more than 2.5 inches is what we want. So we're going to double check that. You probably can't see this because crappy lighting under here, and I can't get the camera close enough, but you'll have to take my word for it. Okay, we're about 2 5/8 on this side, so that's good. It gives us an extra little bit of breathing room. And on the other side that you can't see because of the camera angle, hey, look at that. We're at 2 5/8 on that side as well, so that's great. Now, we've got about an inch of clearance between the tire and the inside. At the back here, the front looks to be about the same, so we're good there. On this side, we've got about an inch on the front. The back side here is a little bit tighter, but that's because I didn't cut the floor pan straight, so we'll fix that. Anyway, looks like the housing is centered, so that's good. Looks like we've got it cut to the right dimension because the slicks are in their happy places on both sides. So we're going to say weld her up and order some axles. So let's do that. If we have a quick look on the inside of the car, you can see what I was talking about. We've got lots of clearance to the inside of the tire in the middle and at the front, but as we get to the back of the tire, things tighten up a bit. But if you look, I was maybe drunk or something when I was cutting the floor pan out because it's not very straight. So if I go back and I straighten that cut out, then we'll have enough clearance at the back of the tire where everything is good. On the other side, everything looks pretty good for clearance. Don't need to trim anything anymore. So yeah, we're good to go on the housing. It's the next day now. Got a different shirt because I ripped the old one. It's well into August here now, but it's still crazy hot and humid, and the noise that you're hearing right now is actually my dehumidifier running to try and at least knock down the humidity in the shop to something somewhat tolerable. But before I just start madly welding everything up on here, we want to fixture everything as best as possible. So we've got some 5/8 threaded rod that we're going to put through the lower control arm mounts and brace all of that stuff up for when I weld these onto the housing. We're going to pull out my fake stub axles, and we're going to put the mandrel in from the rear end narrowing jig. we're going to take this thing off because it's in the way. While I've got the jig or the housing on the jig, pretty much all the welding that I'm going to do on this thing, I should do it with the jig in place because things will distort. So some of the other welding that I want to do is, well, I've got to weld on the upper control arm mounts. I've also got a fill plug that I want to add up here, weld that on. I've got a drain plug that I want to weld onto the bottom. I've got a tube here that I'm going to run across the lower control arm mounts and then onto the bottom of the housing here too, to tie all of this stuff together. And of course, most importantly, I've got to weld on the housing ends. So once that's all done, then I can pull out the jig, send this thing out for sandblasting and powder coating, and call it done at that point. So let's get all my fixturing in place. Let's get the stub axles out. Let's get the mandrel in, and take it from there. Alright, we've got everything fixtured up and ready to weld, so we're going to use a combination of welders here. We're going to use the MIG welder to weld on the lower control arm brackets. We're going to use the MIG welder to weld on the housing ends. This is going to be a big weld, so we're going to do this in 2 passes. We'll do a root pass and then we'll do a cover pass. Upper control arm mounts, not a problem. Can use the MIG. I can get that done in 1 pass. But problem is, on the inside of the upper control arm mounts, I can't get the MIG torch in there. Can't get the TIG torch in there. So on that one, we are going to go old school, stick welder, because the stick is thin and I can get the stick all the way across that inner weld on both sides. So if you like smoky welds, we're going to go old school. So let's get after it. So if you've seen any of these other YouTube videos that show you how you can narrow rear end by just, cutting off a piece and then maybe using some angle iron or something to just align the housing ends to the main housing, this is why you need a rear end narrowing fixture that grabs the bearing at the housing end, goes through the bearings in the carrier, which you can't see right now, and then comes out the other end, and again is aligned with the bearings. If you look at the misalignment that you can see here between the housing ends and the housing on both sides, okay, if I would have just lined up those housing ends externally to this housing and welded them up, there would have been a pretty significant misalignment of the axles. So yeah, don't believe everything you see on YouTube or on the internet. To do things properly, you need to have the proper tools. ran into a little bit of a intruder where I want to put the fill plug. It's got this little clip here for the brake lines. So we're going to hack that off. And I don't like using the exploding death wheels, the zip discs. So I've been a big fan of these. Let me find you a new one where you can still read it. These diamond tipped metal cutting wheels. These things don't explode. They don't make a ton of smell. They don't make a ton of sparks. I mean, they'll still make sparks, but not like a zip disc. But they don't explode. So, yeah, I'm not sponsored by these guys, but I swear by these things. So we're going to zip this thing off. And then obviously we've got to clean all the rust off of here and then off the bottom of the housing too, to put the drain plug on. And I still have my brace that I need to weld across the bottom of the housing too. So we need to clean up some of the rusty housing, but let's start by zipping this thing off. All right, we've got our 9-inch rear end housing all narrowed up and all welded up for the Epic. It's a lot shorter than it used to be, considering we cut this much off on both sides. I'll let you admire my welds from a pandemic safe 6 and whatever feet, 2.5 meters. Part of my health problems is chronic pain, and lately there's been a lot in my hands and my arms, which create shaky hands and difficult to weld. Plus my good welding helmet crapped out, so I had to use the crappy one, so I couldn't really see what I was doing half the time when I was welding. But excuse. I'm not a welder. I'm just a simple country engineer. So anyway, still got a couple of things to do on this. Need to clean up the threads on the fill plug because it's jamming up a little bit. Need to pull out some of the fixturing still. The main fixture needs to come out, but I'm really happy to see that the pucks on both sides slide out really nice and easy, which means that there's no residual stresses in there, so all of the welding didn't tweak the housing. So we've got a good straight housing. That's great. Still, I'm going to clean the thing up, get some of the rust off of here. Ultimately, I'm going to powder coat it, but before that, I'm just going to shoot some black on it to keep it from rusting, because who knows how long it's going to be before I get the powder coat on there. And I still need to make some brackets for the wheelie bars, but I don't know where they need to be yet. Have to get this all assembled and mocked up. Once I figure that out, then I can do those brackets, and then I can finally send it out and get it powder coated. But at this point, we are ready to order axles, so I will fill out the spec sheets and get Mark Williams on the phone and get some axles on order and see how long that takes. And once I've got axles, we can actually put this thing on wheels and see what the ride height's going to look like, see what the stance is going to look like, see if I'm happy with it or not, and take it from there. So, if you've watched this far, thanks. Most people don't watch to the end of the video from the stats that I see in anyway. As usual, like, comment, subscribe. If you haven't already, share with your friends, and we'll see you on the next video.